We talked already about some of the differences between exchange-traded funds, mutual funds, and hedge funds. And those differences that we talked about are primarily having to do with how they're traded and how visible what they're holding is to those who invest. Another very, very important sort of difference is how are the managers of these funds compensated? In other words, there's some sort of rule for each one that shows how the fund managers make money. And that's very, very important because the manner in which they're paid incentivizes them to trade or act in certain ways. So let's talk about each one of these individually. Before I get started, though, I have to introduce one concept here. It's called Assets Under Management, or AUM. And this is a buzzword that simply means how much money is being managed by the fund. It's important because for all of these, part of the compensation is a percentage of the AUM. The managers of ETFs are compensated according to an expense ratio, which is simply some percentage of AUM. Expense ratios for ETFs are usually pretty low. They vary from as low as 0.01% or 1 BIP, as that might be called, to as high as 1%. But one that's up to 1% is fairly high and pretty unusual. Mutual fund managers are also compensated using an expense ratio. These are somewhat higher than ETFs. They range from a low of typically about 0.5% to some that are very high, up to 3%. Now, what's the reason for this difference? Well, mutual fund managers will tell you that the way they manage funds requires much more skill. They have much more discretion than those who are managing ETFs. ETFs usually are tied to an index. As an example, a popular ETF, SPY, is supposed to track the S&P 500. And all that an ETF manager has to do in that case is just make sure that they are holding all the stocks in the S&P 500. Mutual funds, on the other hand, supposedly use more skill, and therefore they can charge a higher expense ratio, both for the costs of their research and also for their skill. Finally, hedge funds are a completely different breed in terms of how their managers are compensated. They follow an old model called 2 and 20, which means 2 or 2% of AUM plus 20% of the profits. So as you can see, it's higher than both of these other methods. And most importantly, it includes this component relating to profits, that 20%. Now, one or two other things to clarify here. What I've been talking about is the way that the folks who manage these funds are compensated. Separately, if you are an investor in one of these funds, in other words, you give your money to one of these types of funds to be managed, your return is based on how much the value of that fund increases. And in most cases, that increase is subject to what happens to the economy or what happens in the markets. Let's look at a more detailed example of this 2 and 20 structure.